The first thing Silas Blackwood noticed was the white of her dress, a stark and lonely flag against the deep green of the blueberry patch that bordered his creek. The second thing he noticed was how she ate, with a desperate, hurried grace that spoke of a hunger deeper than one afternoon could cause. Her hands, stained purple with juice, moved from bush to mouth with a rhythmic precision, as if she were trying to gather a season's worth of sustenance before a storm broke. She was young, Chinese, and utterly alone in the vast, sun-bleached expanse of the Montana Territory. Silas watched from the tree line, his horse shifting beneath him. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but this felt different. This was a fragile thing cast adrift in a hard land. His ranch, a sprawling and increasingly unmanageable tract of land he'd inherited, had become a quiet testament to his own slow decline since his wife, Martha, had passed 2 years prior. The fences sagged, the cabin porch listed to one side, and the dust inside seemed to multiply on its own. He had enough to get by, but the life had gone out of the work. He nudged his horse forward, the sound of a snapping twig finally making the woman freeze. Her head shot up, eyes wide with the primal fear of a startled deer. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified, ready to bolt. He saw the grime on her dress then, the smudges of dirt and the faint tear near the hem. She had been on the road for some time. He raised a hand slowly, keeping his voice low and even. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't relax, but she didn't run. She watched him, her body coiled like a spring. "Those berries are on my land," Silas said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "But there's more than enough for the birds, the bears, and a traveler." She said nothing. Her gaze flickered from his face to the rifle holstered on his saddle, then back again. He understood. A lone woman, a strange man on a horse. The arithmetic was simple and brutal out here. He dismounted, moving with a deliberate slowness that cost him a measure of his pride. He wasn't an old man, not yet, but grief had stiffened his joints. "You look like you've walked a fair piece." A small, hesitant nod. Her hands dropped to her sides, the berry stain stark against her pale skin. "My name is Silas Blackwood," he offered. "This is my ranch." She finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Lynn." Just the one name. That was common enough. People shed old names like snakeskins when they came west. He gestured back toward the direction of his cabin, hidden by a rise. "I've got a well with clean water. And food that doesn't grow on a bush, if you're interested." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Nothing was free. A meal always had a price, and she looked as though she had paid it too many times. "I'm not asking for anything in return," Silas added, reading her thoughts. "Just looks like you could use a proper meal and a safe place to rest for a night." She considered this, her gaze sweeping over the silent, empty landscape around them. There were no other riders, no other homesteads in sight. Whatever danger she was running from, it wasn't here right now. Whatever danger he might represent, it was at least a known quantity. She gave another tiny nod. The walk back to the cabin was quiet. Lynn trailed a few paces behind him, her steps light on the dry earth. When they crested the rise and she saw the state of his home, some of the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else. Pity, perhaps. Or maybe just recognition. It was the home of a man who had given up. Inside, the air was stale. Dishes were piled by the wash basin. A fine layer of dust coated every surface. Silas felt a hot flush of shame. He hadn't realized how bad it had become until he was seeing it through her eyes. He cleared a space at the small wooden table. "Sit. I'll get you that water." She remained standing by the door, a sentinel guarding her own escape. He brought her a tin cup of cool well water, and she drank it in 3 long swallows, her throat working. He saw then that she was younger than he first thought, maybe 24 or 25. Too young to have that haunted look in her eyes. He busied himself at the stove, pulling out a slab of bacon and some potatoes. The work was clumsy. He was a rancher, not a cook. Martha had made this kitchen sing. For him, it was just a place to burn food. After a few minutes of watching him struggle with a knife and a stubborn potato, Lynn spoke. "I can do that." He stopped, looking at her. It was the first full sentence she'd offered. "I can cook," she said, a little stronger this time. She took a hesitant step forward. Silas looked at the mess he was making, then at her determined face. He handed her the knife. Her hands, though stained and calloused, moved with a sureness he hadn't seen in this room for years. She peeled the potatoes into thin, perfect rounds. She sliced the bacon with an economy of motion. She found his meager supply of onions and flour without asking, moving about the small space as if she belonged there. Soon, the cabin was filled with the smell of frying bacon and potatoes, a scent of home that Silas had almost forgotten. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of someone enjoying a hot meal, of a quiet reprieve from a hard road. When she was done, she gathered the plates. He started to protest, but she waved him off, her authority in this small domestic space already absolute. She heated water and washed every dirty dish in the cabin, stacking them neatly to dry. She wiped down the table, the stove, the countertops. Within an hour, the kitchen was cleaner than it had been since the funeral. Silas sat and watched, a strange feeling loosening something in his chest. He was a man who prided himself on needing no one. But the truth was, he was drowning. When she was finished, she stood by the door again, her posture communicating that she was ready to leave, that the transaction was complete. "You can stay the night," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "In the loft. It's safe." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I'm just a tired rancher," he said plainly. "And you're a good cook." He paused, the idea forming as he spoke it. It was a foolish, desperate idea, but the cabin smelled like onions and hope, and he hadn't felt that in a long time. "I need a cook. A housekeeper. This place is too much for one person." She waited. "I can offer room and board. And a wage. Not much, but it's honest." He looked around the clean kitchen, then back at her. The question was bigger than it sounded. It was an offer of sanctuary. A partnership born of mutual desperation. "Can you cook for two?" he asked. Lynn looked at the open door, at the long, dusty road that led to more uncertainty. Then she looked at the clean dishes sparkling in the lamplight. She looked at the tired man who asked for help instead of demanding service. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I can cook for two." What she did not say was that her cruel husband, a man named Wei, had not simply abandoned her. He had sold her contract to a vicious foreman on the railroad line, a man known for breaking spirits as easily as he broke rock. She was not just a widow wandering the countryside. She was property that had run away. And she knew, with a cold certainty, that the foreman would come looking for what he had paid for. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Lynn rose before the sun, her presence transforming the cabin from a dusty shell into a functioning home. The smell of coffee and frying sausage greeted Silas each morning. He would leave for the long day's work of mending fences and tending his small herd of cattle, and return at dusk to a hot meal on the table and a clean, orderly house. She was more than a cook. She had a keen eye and a relentless capacity for work. She patched his worn shirts until they were stronger than new. She started a small vegetable garden near the creek, coaxing life from the hard-packed soil. She even took to mending the harnesses, her small, deft fingers working the stiff leather with surprising strength. Silas found himself watching her, amazed at her resilience. She spoke little of her past, and he did not ask. They communicated through the shared language of work, a respectful distance maintained between them. But the ranch's problems ran deeper than a dusty cabin. One afternoon, Silas returned to find a section of his north fence cut clean through. 20 head of cattle were missing. He spent the next 2 days tracking them, finally finding them scattered in a rocky canyon miles away, just before they wandered into wolf country. It was exhausting work, and he knew it was no accident. The wire had been snipped with fence cutters. The incident forced him into town for supplies, and he asked Lynn to accompany him. He didn't want to leave her alone at the ranch. The town of Prairie Dog Creek was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith. As they tied up their wagon, a man stepped out of the saloon, blocking their path. It was Jedediah Croft, a man who owned the largest ranch in the valley and was methodically buying up smaller claims. He was always dressed in a fine city coat, a stark contrast to the working ranchers around him. He smiled, but it never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Blackwood," Croft said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Good to see you in town. Heard you had some trouble with your herd." "I managed," Silas said, his hand resting near the colt on his hip. Croft's gaze slid over to Lynn, who stood slightly behind Silas, her face impassive. He gave her a long, insolent look, taking in her clean but simple dress, her Chinese features. "And I see you've acquired some new help. Peculiar choice for this part of the country." The street went quiet. Men stopped what they were doing to watch. This was more than a greeting. It was a public challenge. "Lynn is my housekeeper," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "And a better worker than any two men on your payroll, Jedediah." Croft chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Is that so?" "You have to be careful, Silas. Taking in strays can bring trouble. Sometimes they're running from something. Or someone. It can complicate a man's life. Complicate his land claims." The threat was clear. Croft was not just talking about Lynn, he was talking about the ranch. Silas was known in the territory as a quiet man, one who kept to himself since his wife's death. The town expected him to bristle, perhaps, but ultimately back down from a man as powerful as Croft. Instead, Silas took a deliberate step forward, positioning himself fully between Croft and Lynn. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity in his eyes was more potent than any shout. "The only thing complicating my claim is your greed, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice cutting through the silence. "And as for my help, she is under my protection. If you or any of your men bother her, or set one foot on my land again, you'll be dealing with me directly." A murmur went through the onlookers. This was not the broken widower they thought they knew. This was a man drawing a line in the dust. Croft's smile tightened. He had miscalculated. He had expected Silas to be an easy target, cowed and isolated. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture. "Just friendly advice, Blackwood. A man in your position should be grateful for it." He turned and walked back into the saloon, his men following like shadows. The ride back to the ranch was tense. Silas felt Lynn's eyes on him, but he kept his own fixed on the horizon. He had made a public declaration. He had turned a private dispute into a town-wide spectacle. He had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley, all for a woman he barely knew. As they neared his property, something caught his eye. A fresh sliver of wood, stark against the grey-green sagebrush. He pulled the wagon to a halt and dismounted. It was a surveyor's stake, driven deep into the earth. It was 100 yards inside his property line, right next to the spring that fed the creek, the only reliable source of water for his entire herd. Croft wasn't just making threats anymore. He was taking the first step to stealing the lifeblood of the ranch. What Silas didn't know was that the stake was not just a claim on his water, it was a signal that a different kind of hunter was now on his way. That night, the small cabin felt charged with unspoken words. Silas sat at the table, methodically cleaning his Winchester rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism the only sound. Lynn worked on the other side of the room, patching a tear in a grain sack, her stitches small and even. The confrontation in town had changed something between them. The careful distance they had maintained was now filled with a shared danger. Finally, Silas broke the silence, his voice low. "He won't stop at a surveyor's stake. Croft wants the water. Without it, my land is worthless." He paused, setting a freshly oiled lever action on the table. "He thinks because I'm alone, I'll break." He looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the lamplit room. My wife, Martha, she loved this place. We built it together from nothing. After she died, I let things go. I suppose I was letting myself go with it. It was the most he had ever said about his past, a confession laid bare on the table next to the rifle. I haven't had much to fight for in a long time. The vulnerability in his voice seemed to open a space for her own. Lynn set aside the grain sack, her hands folding in her lap. He was right, she said quietly. I am running. Silas waited, not moving. My husband did not die, she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He was a gambler. He accrued a large debt to a man who works for the railroad. A cruel man. To settle it, he sold my marriage contract. She reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was worn soft at the creases, the ink faded. She unfolded it and pushed it across the table toward him. It was a legal document, written in English, transferring the rights of a husband to another man. The name signed at the bottom was Way. The name of the recipient was a man named Carter. This Carter, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, he believes he owns me. Way told me to go to him, that I was his property now. I ran instead. Silas picked up the paper. The name Carter meant nothing to him, but the implications were horrifying. Lynn wasn't a widow. She was a fugitive from a form of slavery. Croft must know, Silas realized aloud, the pieces clicking into place. That's why he was so confident. He thinks he can use this against me. Against you. He looked at the paper, at the legal scrawl that claimed ownership of the quiet, determined woman across from him. This was Croft's true weapon. Not fence cutters, but the law itself, twisted into a cudgel. A few days later, their fears took shape. A lone rider approached the cabin. He was not one of Croft's men. He was dressed in a dusty but official-looking coat and wore a badge that marked him as a territorial agent. He was here on business. Silas met him on the porch, positioning himself in the doorway. Lynn was inside, out of sight, but he could feel her presence behind him like a silent prayer. Afternoon, the agent said, tipping his hat. I'm looking for a Chinese woman. Answers to the name of Lynn. About so high, young. Seen anyone like that pass through? Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment of truth. He could hand her over. He could end the threat from Croft, wash his hands of the whole affair, and return to his quiet, lonely life. The law was on the agent's side. It would be the safe, sensible thing to do. He thought of the clean kitchen, the mended harnesses, the small garden by the creek. He thought of her terrified eyes at the blueberry patch, and the quiet dignity with which she had stood behind him in town. He thought of the line he had drawn in the dust. He looked the agent square in the eye, his face a mask of weary indifference. Can't say that I have, he lied, the words tasting strange in his mouth. A woman like that, alone? She wouldn't last long out here. He gestured vaguely to the east. Might have seen a wagon with some Chinese laborers heading toward the Dakota border a few weeks back. Maybe she was with them. The agent studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. Silas didn't flinch. He held the man's gaze, his hand resting casually on the doorframe, inches from the shotgun he kept propped there. Finally, the agent seemed to accept it. All right then, he said, turning his horse. Appreciate your time. Silas watched until the rider was a small dot on the horizon. He stepped back inside, his legs suddenly weak. Lynn was standing by the stove, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the iron cooktop. She had heard everything. He had just lied to a lawman. He had harbored a fugitive. He had willingly made himself an outlaw, all for her? The partnership of convenience, the arrangement of a wage for work, had been burned away in that single, decisive lie. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Winter came early that year, blanketing the high plains in a thick layer of snow. The world shrank to the boundaries of the ranch, a quiet, isolated pocket of warmth and life. Inside the cabin, a remarkable transformation had taken place. The threat from Croft and Carter had galvanized them. Instead of breaking them apart, it had forged them into a formidable team. Lynn had proven to be as sharp with numbers as she was with a hoe. At her quiet urging, Silas had pulled out his old, neglected ledger. Together, they went over years of accounts, sales receipts, and supply costs. Lynn's methodical mind found a pattern Silas had missed in his grief-stricken haze. For 3 years, the cattle broker in town, a man known to be in Croft's pocket, had been shorting Silas on the weight of his cattle at market. A few pounds here, a few there, it added up to a small fortune. It was systematic, deliberate fraud. Armed with this evidence, Silas had made a perilous, secret journey to the territorial capital in Helena before the first heavy snow. He didn't go to the local marshal, who was also friendly with Croft. He went to the U.S. Marshal, a man with a reputation for being unbending and immune to small-town politics. He presented the ledger with Lynn's neat columns and calculations showing the consistent discrepancies. He also brought a sworn statement from another small rancher Croft had squeezed, a man who found his courage when he learned he wasn't alone. Now, they waited. The ranch became their fortress. They reinforced the corral, laid in massive stores of firewood, and inventoried every sack of flour and slab of bacon. Lynn managed the pantry and the household with military precision, ensuring nothing was wasted. By the time the blizzards hit, the ranch was more secure and better run than it had ever been, even when Martha was alive. Silas found a new purpose in his work, a sense of fighting for something, not just against something. One cold December morning, they saw riders approaching. Not one, but 4. For a heart-stopping moment, Silas thought it was Croft and his men, come to take matters into their own hands. He grabbed his Winchester as Lynn moved to the window. But the lead rider wasn't Croft. It was the U.S. Marshal from Helena, and Jedediah Croft was riding beside him, his hands bound. The marshal dismounted, his face grim in the cold air. "Silas Blackwood," he called out. "Your complaint has been investigated. Mr. Croft is under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and land theft. His claims on this territory, including the water rights to your spring, are hereby declared void." Relief washed over Silas so powerfully he felt lightheaded. He looked past Croft to see the town's cattle broker also in custody. It was over. The power that had loomed over the valley was broken. With Croft's influence gone, a man like Carter would have no allies here, no one to help him enforce his cruel contract. Lynn was finally safe. That evening, the cabin was quiet, but it was a deep, peaceful silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. Silas took the worn, folded piece of paper, Lynn's marriage contract, from the mantelpiece where he had kept it. He held it out to her. She looked at it, the symbol of her bondage, then looked at him. She didn't take it. She simply nodded. He walked to the stove, opened the small iron door, and dropped the paper into the flames. They watched together as the ink curled and the edges blackened, turning to weightless grey ash. The last tie to her old life, to her fear, was gone. He turned back to her, the firelight catching the lines of weariness and strength on his face. He was not a man for grand speeches or flowery words. His hands, calloused from a lifetime of hard work, were what he spoke with. "The ledger," he said, his voice steady. "It needs a new name at the top. I was thinking it should read a Blackwood and..." He let the sentence hang in the warm air between them. A slow smile spread across Lynn's face, the first genuine, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her, chasing the last of the shadows from her eyes. It was a smile that spoke of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of a home built not of wood and nails, but of courage and quiet loyalty. "Blackwood and Lynn," she said, her voice soft but sure. "That sounds right." It was not a declaration of love, not yet. It was something stronger, something earned. It was a statement of partnership, an acknowledgement that the two of them, a broken rancher and a fugitive woman, had found in each other the one thing neither knew they were looking for. Out here on the vast and unforgiving frontier, true freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing, finally, who to stand with. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.